Welcome to this explainer. We're diving into something truly profound today, one of the most consequential historical and theological questions in all of Christian history. Let's set this up as a formal yet pastorally charitable disputation. On one side, we have Karl Keating laying out the strongest Roman Catholic arguments. On the other, we have Bishop Zacchaeus representing the Western Orthodox response. Keep this one absolutely crucial thing in mind as we go. The historical question we are tackling isn't actually about Petrine primacy. Both sides completely agree Peter had primacy. The real debate? It's about universal Roman supremacy. Here is our roadmap for tracing the evolution of this ecclesiology. 1. Holy Scripture. 2. Apostolic Fathers. 3. Ecumenical Councils. 4. Chalcedon and the Pentarchy. 5. Medieval forgeries. And 6. The First Vatican Council. Let's jump right in.
Section 1. Holy Scripture and Petrine Primacy. We're starting right in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 16. Karl Keating argues this moment is the absolute foundation. Christ changes Simon's name to Peter, the Rock, and hands him the keys to the kingdom. Keating points out that, historically, a name change signifies a divinely appointed vocation. He builds the case that this establishes a continuing, supreme Davidic stewardship. And because a stewardship is an office, it doesn't just die with Peter, it passes exclusively to the bishops of Rome. It's a really powerful argument for a supreme, continuing office.
But here is where Bishop Zacchaeus steps in, taking us straight to the Book of Acts. Now, Zacchaeus absolutely affirms Peter's primacy, no question. Peter preaches first, and he initiates major decisions. But look closely at the text, and you see profound conciliarity. Peter is sent by the apostles to Samaria. After baptizing Cornelius, he actually has to explain himself and be accountable to the Jerusalem believers. And later, in Galatians, he's publicly corrected by Paul. So Zacchaeus argues this paints a picture of a shared, conciliary apostolic ministry, not a supreme jurisdictional monarchy where Peter's word just unilaterally ends all discussion.
Okay, let's pause for a second. What have we actually established here? Well, the historical evidence undeniably establishes true Petrine primacy. Peter is definitively the leader and the chief spokesman. But the Western Orthodox conclusion drawn by Bishop Zacchaeus is that Scripture just doesn't show clear evidence of universal Petrine supremacy over the Apostolic College. He leads, for sure, but he doesn't operate above the other apostles as some separate jurisdictional monarch. Section 2, Apostolic Fathers and Episcopal Unity. Moving into the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Karl Keating brings in early giants like St. Irenaeus and St. Cyprian. Keating highlights how Irenaeus pointed to Rome's preeminent origin, stating every church must agree with it. Add to that Cyprian speaking so reverently of the chair of Peter. For Keating, this is rock-solid proof that early Christians recognized Roman supremacy and a strict doctrinal obligation to the Roman bishop. Bishop Zacchaeus, however, asks us to pull back and look at the broader context. Irenaeus was actively battling Gnostic heretics who were claiming secret knowledge. So appealing to Rome was about pointing to a very public, unshakable witness of apostolic truth, not necessarily bowing to a supreme jurisdictional overlord. And regarding Cyprian, Zacchaeus notes Cyprian's famous quote, "The episcopate is one, each bishop holding his part in its entirety." Cyprian viewed Peter as the ultimate symbol of unity for an undivided, completely equal episcopate, where every canonical bishop holds the absolute fullness of the office, which perfectly sets the stage for a massive historical test, the 3rd century rebaptism controversy. Pope Stephen demanded all churches adopt Rome's practice of rebaptizing heretics, and he actually threatened to break communion over it. Keating rebuts that this bold, sweeping move clearly shows the Pope exercising universal authority. But Bishop Zacharias gets the final reply here, pointing to exactly how Cyprian responded. Cyprian didn't just submit. Instead, he called a synod of North African bishops and famously declared that absolutely no bishop may set himself up as a bishop of bishops or use tyrannical terror to compel his colleagues. Time for a quick structural review. What have we actually established in this patristic era? Without a doubt, the early fathers honored Rome and the chair of Peter immensely. But the Western Orthodox conclusion is that these bishops fundamentally operated under a conciliar ecclesiology. Cyprian's direct, synodical pushback against Pope Stephen is strong evidence that the early church flat-out rejected absolute jurisdictional supremacy, even while maintaining deep respect for Roman primacy. Section 3, Ecumenical Councils and Ancient Custom. Let's fast forward to 325 AD and the Council of Nicaea. Karl Keating's argument here is that these massive early councils simply assumed Rome's unique supreme authority. Because Rome's authority was just an accepted lived reality, Keating suggests that councils didn't even feel the need to formally define papal power. It was just a given. Bishop Zacchaeus counters this by zeroing in on the actual constitutional documents of these councils. Take a look at Canon 6 of Nicaea. It recognizes the regional authority of Alexandria, Antioch, and Rome, but grounds it in ancient custom, not in Petrine succession or divine right. And later on, Canon 3 of Constantinople elevates Constantinople to second place purely because it was the new imperial capital. Zacchaeus argues the councils are using historical and civil logic to organize the church here, not sacramental Petrine theology. So, what have we actually established in this era? The historical evidence shows early councils actively legislating the order of the great churches. The Western Orthodox conclusion? This structural order was built on history, custom, and shared conciliar authority. Think about it. If those bishops believed the Roman Pope was a universal monarch by divine institution, they simply wouldn't have been legislating patriarchal precedents based on shifting imperial geography. Section 4, Chalcedon and the Pentarchy. We've arrived at the incredibly famous Council of Chalcedon. Karl Keating points to a truly massive moment here. When Pope Leo the Great's theological tome was read aloud, the bishops famously acclaimed, "Peter has spoken through Leo." Keating cites this as undeniable, definitive proof that the ancient church recognized the Pope's infallible teaching authority. Now, Bishop Zacchaeus entirely affirms that Western Orthodoxy deeply honors Pope Leo, but he stresses that the sequence of events is everything. The bishops didn't just blindly accept the tome simply because it came from Rome. They critically examined it first. They held it up against the teachings of earlier fathers. Only after they judged it to be perfectly faithful to apostolic tradition did they make that famous acclamation. Zacchaeus argues this is the textbook definition of a conciliar model of reception, not unquestioning submission to a supreme monarch. Chalcedon also solidifies the Pentarchy, the 5 great patriarchal sees: Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. Keating rebuts this by arguing patriarchates are merely administrative, meaning they don't negate papal supremacy. But Zacchaeus delivers a really stunning historical reply. Chalcedon enacted Canon 28, which elevated Constantinople's privileges, despite Pope Leo's direct vocal objections. The council passed it anyway, which proves the church believed conciliar authority regulated patriarchal order, not the Pope acting entirely on his own. Reviewing Section 4, what have we established? Pope Leo was deeply honored, and Rome definitely remained first. But the Western Orthodox conclusion is that the undivided church preserved its communion through its conciliar life. The bishops examined doctrine together, they organized the church together. The shared preservation of the apostolic faith was supreme, not isolated Roman jurisdiction. Section 5, Medieval Forgeries and Papal Claims. Okay, we're entering a really historically complex era, the Middle Ages. Bishop Zacchaeus introduces this section by noting that over several centuries, genuine Roman primacy was gradually expanded into supremacy. And importantly, this expansion was heavily aided by documents that were widely believed to be true at the time, but were later exposed as complete inauthentic forgeries. Tracing this from the 4th to the 15th centuries, documents like the alleged delation of Constantine and the pseudo-Isidorian decretals presented this incredibly impressive but fabricated historical record supporting broad papal authority. Now, Karl Keating rightly cautions us here. He's quick to point out that modern Roman Catholicism absolutely does not base the papacy on these forgeries. The First Vatican Council never relied on them. Keating argues these documents merely reflected and supported ideas that were already organically present in the church. Bishop Zacchaeus agrees that the forgeries didn't just invent Roman primacy out of thin air, but he points out their immense, undeniable practical impact. These documents were accepted in completely good faith by generations of canon lawyers, bishops, and theologians. Because they firmly believed these documents were ancient, it deeply accelerated and legally cemented the medieval concept of universal supremacy right into Western canon law. It essentially shaped the very legal consciousness of the medieval church. So, what have we actually established about the Middle Ages? The evidence undeniably shows these documents were forgeries, and modern scholars across the board agree they didn't create the papacy. However, the Western Orthodox conclusion is that they significantly influenced the historical development and legal articulation of papal supremacy. They provided false historical precedents that made later expansive papal claims seem ancient, when in reality, they just weren't. Section 6, the First Vatican Council. Held from 1869 to 1870. Karl Keating's argument here is that this council did not invent some brand new doctrine. Instead, he says it authentically developed and formally defined the papal supremacy and infallibility that had been present in seed form ever since Christ spoke to Peter back in Matthew 16. For Keating, this is simply organic doctrinal maturation.
Bishop Zacchaeus counters by looking really closely at the specific language defined by the council. He applies the ancient Vincentian standard that true Catholic doctrine is what has been believed everywhere, always, and by all. Zacchaeus argues that true development preserves identity, but the First Vatican Council's very specific definition of the Pope possessing supreme, full, immediate, and ordinary jurisdiction fundamentally redefined the constitutional structure of the undivided Church we saw in the first millennium. For our final review, what have we actually established today? The historical evidence undeniably proves Rome's ancient primacy, its honor, and its immense influence. That's a historical reality. But the Western Orthodox conclusion is that the highly specific constitutional claims defined at the First Vatican Council simply lack the universal patristic consensus of the first millennium. The ancient Church operated as a conciliar communion, not a universal monarchy.
Which leaves us with a final, really profound question. If Christ is the head of his church, does the path to healing our ancient divisions lie in submission to one supreme office? Or does it lie in recovering the shared conciliar communion of the undivided church? Both of these traditions love Christ deeply. And perhaps by looking honestly at the structure of the early church, we can find a true path forward for Christian unity. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, keep digging into the history, and keep asking great questions.